And if you're still here after all these episodes, thank you for listening, because you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion, aka our top 5 of the first 100 episodes.
Well, it's not really top 5.
For our little mini Q&A.
After 100 episodes, we've been asked a lot of questions. It's been 2 years. People are always like, who was your favorite guest, favorite band? So we've taken all those questions and we've narrowed them down to 5. And we'll kind of go around the table here and ask each of us those types of questions to kind of get an idea of what we thought was the craziest stuff that's happened in 100 episodes. And we've got that for you tonight if you want to listen to it. This will be like a midweek release, so don't worry. You're not getting this in place of anything. You're going to get your regularly scheduled discography discussion just as planned. But this is just a little extra, and this helps us answer some questions in a much bigger way than we would be able to individually. So I hope you enjoy it.
I'm going to lead right off and say, Dan, what was your favorite band we talked about in the first 100 episodes?
Oh, that's rough, man. And it's easy for me to say something like Hope's Fall or Zao, so I'm going to avoid that because those are just like some of my favorite bands anyway.
You better not steal my answer, asshole.
I'm not going to steal your answer, you fuck. Calm down. I've been asked this question before, actually, on a different podcast, and I will say that probably my favorite band that we talked about that I wasn't familiar with all of their stuff was Dillinger Escape Plan. I found their stuff to be very much in line with what I loved, and they just fit like a glove for me, and they were one of my favorite bands to talk about. And one of the reasons is just because they were super unpredictable and made me a little uncomfortable in places, and that's the kind of vulnerability I like whenever I'm checking out a band. I mean, obviously, like, if you listen to that conversation over, I was really a huge fan of just the first album and had only skimmed the rest of it during my normal listening history. So whenever we did the episode, I had to listen to all of it, and it definitely gave me a much newer appreciation for the band that I had before. So I'd say they're probably my favorite band that we've talked about on the show so far.
It was definitely The Contortionist. I don't think that's going to come as a very big surprise to people who listen. I've talked about The Contortionist on a pretty regular basis on the show. I liked the fact that I kind of opened myself up and was probably the most honest I've been on any of the episodes. You got to see more of who Jeff is, the person, instead of Jeff, the performing artist on a podcast who's being a dickhole. It was just me at my, my rawest and being honest with everybody. So that's probably why it's my favorite band, is because I got to share a little bit of who I am personally with everybody.
It would be real easy for me to come in and say Adam Ship, because we talked about Adam Ship real early in the podcast. It would be even easier for me to say we listen to so much metal. I loved talking about The Offspring because it was a change of pace. But the band I enjoyed talking about the most is Dead Z. Dead Z is a band that I really feel like I'm the only person that likes it, except for Dan. And then people just keep coming back to us saying, this was a great show, this was a great episode. Hey guys, this podcast talked about Dead Z. You should listen to it. They're kind of like the gift that keeps on giving. And I'm glad that we got to talk about them, even though they're not strictly metal. Kind of got that industrial orgy type vibe going on, but they are something different.
I don't know, they haven't given me any gifts lately. It's been quite a few years since we've gotten anything new out of Dead Z.
Well, now that we got your favorite band out of the way, Jeff, what was your favorite guest of the first 100 episodes?
Ooh, it's a tie for me, actually. Is that okay?
I guess so.
So it was definitely, I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Matt Nas. Love that dude. I had so much fun on that episode. And the tie with him was actually the guys from Not Beneath, Josh and Dan. Those guys were awesome. had so much fun talking about Meshuggah with them. So I really enjoyed myself on both of those episodes. Probably outside of the Contortionist episode with me open myself up, those two episodes with just kind of talking. It was just like a bunch of guys talking, having fun, and enjoying themselves. And I really did. Those are some super sweet guys, and I hope we get them back eventually.
Well, I'd say my favorite guest on the show. This is hard because I've liked certain things about every guest, so to speak. So that's the politically correct answer. But I guess one of my favorite guests is a recurring guest, which would have to be Brandon Kellum of American Standards. And the reason for that is because Brandon was the first person that we ever talked to. Before Brandon, we didn't really have a plan in place for talking to guests on the show. And Brandon was the first person to reach out to us and be like, hey, you guys want to do an episode? And at first we were kind of like, well, I mean, I guess. And then I heard his band. I liked it. And Brandon, though, beyond that, just being the first guest or whatever, has been a recurring guest because Brandon gets what we do here. And whenever he shows up as a guest host, he really brings it. He does the research, he listens to the bands, and gives his own unique perspective on it. And I like that in a guest because we don't have to prep him up. I can call Brandon anytime and be like, dude, we're going to talk about such and such band. Are you in? And he'll always be like, yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I don't have to explain to him what we do on the show or anything like that. He's with it. And his perspective is always unique and always a lot of fun. So I definitely enjoy having Brandon on the show.
I agree. He's always a pro's pro.
Yeah, I mean, I even, trusted him to replace myself on the show whenever my wife was having a baby. Because I was like, no, if anybody's going to bring it to the level that I feel like I try to bring it every week, it's Brandon, and there was no question about it, and it turned out great.
I want to say Chad Kent, because Chad is my favorite drummer of all time. Chad broke several rules on this podcast. It's not his fault. It's our fault, because he was more of an interview. It was an opportunity to talk to somebody that we all enjoyed listening to, a record, The Crash of 47, that we still listen to, especially me, weekly. That was more of an interview. And we're definitely going to have him back on the show when he wants to talk about Stryper. But the person that I would say is my favorite guest has been James Rolfe. He's been on several times. He went out of his way to talk to us about Judas Priest the day after he went to the show. He loved talking about Black Sabbath. Rob Zombie blew it out of the water. And I'm ready for him to come back and keep talking to us about bands that he likes.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. I mean, that's going to be exciting, and we'll definitely try our best to get James back on the show as soon as we can.
Yeah, that's the fun / challenging part is we really haven't had a bad guest, so to speak, for the most part. So it's nice being able to shed light on all these guys because they've all been great to us.
Well, what was the conversation that surprised you then?
Easily, it was more of the response to the conversation that we had, and that would be the Nine Inch Nails conversation. Was not expecting to get I got a little bit of blowback, and I was kind of surprised. But yeah, so that's definitely the most surprised that I have been. The constructive criticism that I got off of that episode caught me a little off guard. So that's easily the most surprised that I've been really for anything on this podcast.
We talked about mindless self-indulgence with Matt Nas. I was very surprised that Dan showed up that day. But the Scott Mellinger conversation, where we initially talked to him about Neurosis, I was frustrated at points that it was going so far off track that I didn't think we were going to have a usable episode at a couple places. But what it turned into was a very old school discography discussion way of approaching the conversation, where we talked about a band with someone and also got a piece of their perspective on life, which gave insight into the band we were talking about. And I feel like we got more of Scott in that conversation than we got about Neurosis. And that was a first for us. Actually, that might have been a second, because we kind of had the same situation with Travis Turner, now that I think about it.
Yeah, the Travis Turner one was crazy. This is not my response to the question, but the Travis Turner one was definitely one of those, like, we're supposed to be talking about death, but there's so much other stuff. It's like the conversation was fighting us the entire time. I think back then we didn't have as solid of a format as we do now. That was episode 10. So, 100 episodes later, we kind of have a better idea of what we're doing over here. But, yeah, that one was actually pretty surprising, like some of the places the conversation went. And I wouldn't change any of it for the world, because some of the stories that we shared on that and the Scott Millinger episode, were worth it, and kind of gave people a picture of who we are, who the guest is. And I think it all just melded together really well.
That was episode 12.
Oh, was it 12?
I thought it was 11.
Brandon Kellum was episode 10. That's what it was. I would say that the conversation that surprised me the most, it's got to be the Azalea dying conversation with John Beatty. Like, it just has to be.
Your Honor, I object
to
this insider trading.
It's... Okay, so this conversation was almost 4 hours long in the form that we released it. The actual conversation was closer to 5.5 hours. There was a lot of talk removed from the podcast that was completely off topic. If you want to talk about the conversation fighting us to stay on track, that's absolutely what this episode was. But there's a few things that are notable about it. The first thing is that we didn't just talk about Azalea dying, but we talked about Christian metalcore overall. The evolution of it. We talked a lot about Haste the Day. I sent John a text the other day being like, dude, that Azalea dying episode, we spent a half hour talking about Haste the Day for some reason. And we talk about a lot of the bands that were around Azalea dying, the bands that influenced Azalea dying, and we went through the whole thing. But the thing that surprised me the most is how much we talked about, whether or not we would support the band with Tim and his convictions and being out of prison, and we speculated a lot about whether the band was ever going to get back together or not.
And then the band essentially answered that question
like
for
the
us.
next day.
Like the next day.
The next day, they post this video. It's like a teaser, 30 seconds, and it shows somebody picking up the microphone. And we're like, no way, no way. And then, like, our listeners were, like, screenshotting individual people's hands and matching their tattoos up to people that were in the band prior. And we were just like, holy shit, like, they're actually going to get back together. And pretty much everything that I said on the episode was wrong about whether they were going to get back together or not. So I think that, to me, is super surprising because we had no idea. And I was asked after we did that episode if we knew, like if we had any kind of inside information. And the answer was always no. We just decided to do Azalea Dying this week, just like we would have decided to do any other band any other week. First time that we were really newsworthy. People started flocking to that episode right after the announcements came out. Totally shocked. I had no idea that that's how that was going to go down.
You should have lied to him, Dan. Say, yes, we knew exactly what was going on.
I feel like a lot of what you just said applies to every conversation we've had with Stephen Mark Sorrow.
Oh, man.
We went off track. We came back on track. We talked about Christian metal. We went back off of track. And at the end of the day, we were all buds.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things about this podcast is that we stay friends with all the people that we talk to. Always stay in constant communication. And that's, to me, one of the most satisfying things about doing a podcast, about getting to meet new people. Meet new people from your basement. How about that? We live in a wonderful age of technology now where we get to talk to people we never thought we were going to get to talk to.
The internet is a wonderful thing.
Totally.
I feel like we talked about that very subject over 10 years ago with Vaughn Gregory from Grave Forsaken.
Yeah.
And it was a privilege to bring him back and talk to him again.
About one of his favorite bands, Tourniquet.
Absolutely.
That was a fun one for sure.
So what was the band that changed your mind in the first 100 episodes of this show?
So a band that changed your mind in that you thought they were going to be good and then they weren't, or a band that you thought was going to be bad or they weren't? I think we should do an example of each.
Oh, I just think You pick an either or. Which one shocked you the most?
All right, well, I'm going to give both the answers, I think, because there's two different bands I can think of. The first one, obviously, is Cannibal Corpse.
I think we can all agree on that.
It was like 14 albums, and I was like, oh, God, I don't know if I want to do this, because I was literally envisioning every single album to sound like Butchered at Birth 14 times. And I had heard other Cannibal Corpse, after that, but whenever we sat down and did our deep dive, I was really surprised that everything after Vile, it was like a different band. And they were doing all the cool shit that I like for death metal bands to do while still having those crazy, gory, fucked up lyrics. And I found that really, really enjoyable overall. And I think with Cannibal Corpse, they just completely changed my mind, and I came out of it a true believer and like an actual fan of the band as opposed to a band that I just kind of knew stuff about. And I would say on the opposite of that would be Mushroom Head. Over the years, I've listened to Mushroom Head, and I've heard songs. I've liked songs by Mushroom Head. I've liked certain albums by them. I've kind of followed them. But the truth is when I sat down and listened to all that shit all at once, I was like, okay. When you put it all together, it's just a giant tapestry of bullshit. And I couldn't stand it, and it upset me, and I went into the episode thinking it was going to be super positive and like talking about how great the band was. But after listening to all the albums, I was just like, I can't really find a great thing to say. There's so many missed opportunities, so many things that they could have done that they didn't do, and so many things that they did that they should not have done. So it just left me feeling like, oh man, I can't do this. This band is too much for me, and it ended up being a really negative episode, and I was really surprised by that.
My answer may be the most recent. Fit for a King. We listened to Dark Skies on Patreon back in September, and I liked it. I really enjoyed listening to it, and I was really worried that this was just a modern-sounding metal band that had a whole lot of wannabe Asking Alexandria shit in the background. I didn't expect that when we did an episode about the band that I would have as much fun listening to it as I did, because it wasn't just that. It was a lot of pieces of metal that I like, even the modern ones, and it didn't let up. There was no downside to listening to Fit for a King.
I'm glad to hear that, because I really like them. My positive surprise is definitely on the same lines as Dan. Cannibal Corpse, after Chris Barnes left, is amazing. Corpse Grinder is the man. Enough said. And I'm trying to think as far as like a negative feel, like after listening to something. There's a couple of them that kind of pop in my head. But I think the one I'm going to have to go with is actually an episode that I wanted to do. And that was Iced Earth. I was kind of a pretty big honk on Iced Earth for a while. But listening to their entire discography, like in a sitting, it is lackluster, unfortunately. It's not what I thought I was going to get. I thought that I was like, yes, I picked out an awesome power metal band. We're going to kick some ass. And it totally fell flat. And I've never changed my mind on a band or convinced myself to change my mind with a couple of buddies like this ever before. That's the first time where I went into something thinking that, yes, this is going to be a great episode, and then walking out thinking, well, it was still a great episode, but I'm not nearly as big of a fan as I thought I would be after the fact.
Yeah, fuck you, by the way, for that.
Yeah, because that was a whole lot of listening, guys. I'm sorry.
I'd heard 2 albums by that band and was like, I guess it'll be fine. And then, oh my God, it was not fine.
No, it was
Something
not.
wicked indeed.
This way comes.
Ugh.
Before we answer the last question, I'm going to try to lead everyone into their answer by saying if you had a limited cellular data connection and you could download one episode of this podcast and listen to it, what's the one episode you would go back and listen to?
Oh, it's easy for me. Without even a second thought, it's definitely the In Flames episode. And it's mainly because that was back when Dan used to do these epic rants. And the best rants. And I had a pretty decent couple
when
on there
did he
too.
stop doing those epic rants?
Oh, you're going to tell me that he has epic rants now like he did on that In Flames episode?
Are you telling me I need to have more epic rants?
Maybe. You've only had a handful of them since then in the last, what, that's like a year and a half, 2 years ago?
I like to think when Dan has an epic rant, it means something.
I was going to
Because
say...
it doesn't happen every single week.
I was going to say, I don't hate everything I listen to. So this was just... It takes quite a bit to get me on that level. And by quite a bit, I mean quite a bit of alcohol.
Well, it's not only quite a bit of alcohol. You also had one of your favorite bands essentially turn into bubblegum pop for the dollar sign, which is fine. But they kept on telling everybody that they were, oh yeah, we're heavy. Bullshit, you guys are horrible now. Although the new single starts out heavy and then gets bubblegummy. So we'll see how that goes on the new album.
I think my ploy actually worked in this case because I was going to ask Jeff what his most insane moment of the first 100 episodes was.
Yeah, same episode. It's
right, but what was your most insane moment from that episode?
The rant. The fucking rants were great on that episode.
Which one? There were like 3 of them.
I thought it was pretty insane talking to Toby Wright. We got to meet the man.
I think that for me, it's got to be episode 45. All about thrash metal with Rob Rivera of Nonpoint. And the reason for that is that it starts off like a relatively normal conversation between a bunch of dudes that like thrash metal. And that's totally cool. But towards the end of it, Rob and I start kind of trying to one-up each other as to who can mention the most obscure thrash metal or death metal band. And at one point, we issue a challenge, which we haven't delivered on yet, where we're like, you know what, we're going to do metal APCs. And whoever can come up with the most obscure band names gets to be the host of the show. And I'll never forget what Rob said. He goes, well, it looks like I'm going to be the host of a podcast here really soon. And yeah, I mean, I hope we can get that together at some point. I know we've had Rob on again after that, but that was to talk about his band Nonpoint. But that episode's really insane for me, and it's kind of fun hearing somebody that is as big of a nerd as I am, albeit massively much more successful, you know, to kind of get down on that level with me, and we can be all like, well, yeah, but what about this band? Well, what about that one? And, you know, and then we start making rules at some point about how it has to be in the United States, okay? It can't be, you know, obscure, to which Jeff's like, well, I guess I'll go take a piss for an hour. And it just got really fun to do that back and forth. And so that was kind of insane for me because typically my level of nerddom on this podcast is unmatched. And in this case, I definitely met my match and was pretty humbled by it. And I think the most mind-blowing part of that episode when he was like, you guys listen to Believer? And I was like, hell yeah, I listen to Believer. He's like, okay, well, what's this track called on this Believer album? Oh shit, the song's called Nonpoint. Mind blown. I had never made that connection before, and he just blew my mind right there on the podcast for all you guys to hear. You can hear my brain seeping out of my ears for the rest of the episode.
The guilty pleasure of the first year we were doing this podcast was episode 22, where we talked about Pantera, and we called it the Dantera Spectacular. I don't remember how it started finding its way into the podcast that Dan just did not like Pantera. And it turned into this massive get-together of guests, friends, other podcast hosts. It featured Aaron Kusterer, it featured Brandon Kellum, Josh Toomey, Eric Hall, and everybody was trying to convince Dan to change his mind. And nobody could.
My mind was changed by Dan.
And isn't that interesting? And then at the very end, to bring back Josh, the secret weapon, my only secret weapon, for the episode to end with everybody just giving in to what Dan thinks, it was kind of a metaphor for life, I think. And it was fucking insane.
Don't you forget it. One of the biggest things was, from the beginning, the first time I mentioned on the show that I didn't like Pantera, it got people up in arms. And it's funny because I feel like we ran with it really, really hard because it was so funny. It had such a visceral reaction from people. And part of our job as podcasters is to be entertaining. So we really hit on that. And the thing about the Pantera episode is that we wanted to take all of that negativity that had been thrown my way about it and just make the episode about that. It was supposed to be more of a roast of me than it was a episode about Pantera. It was just so funny how it ended up being an argument and a debate. And from that moment on, there's still people that'll send me messages like, hey man, I really agree with you with what you said about Pantera on this episode. And there's an equal number of people that are like, dude, it was really hard for me to keep listening to your podcast after some of the shit you said about Pantera. And to this day, people still bring it up. We just got a comment on YouTube the other day about it. That just blows my mind in 2019 that somebody's still going back and listening to those 2017 episodes and really digging deep in. And I just think it's incredible. And as a little anecdote, to this day, Joshua Toomey of the Talk To Me podcast will only refer to me either on his own show or anytime he's referring to me at all. It's always referred to as Dan Terra. He can't let it go, and it is hilarious to me. He sent me some fucking stickers, some Talk To Me podcast stickers, and whenever I got the envelope in the mail, it was addressed to Dan Terra. It had my address. And I was like, oh man, this is never gonna end. This is something that's gonna follow me the entire rest of the time we do this show.
Hopefully the past 30 minutes has answered at least some of the questions you may have as a listener. If it didn't, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Twitter at discussmetal, and you can ask all the questions you want. If you want to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. The links will be in the show notes, just like they are on every show. We have individual album reviews. Dan's about to do his 21 album marathon of underground metal bands that he found at a thrift store. And Movie Mosh is coming in 2019. Thank you very much for listening. And get ready for the next episode.